Let's go ahead and dive right in. So I think if you've been here before, you know me. If you are a new caseworker, new congressional staffer, welcome, welcome, welcome. We're so glad you're here. I am Ann Meeker. I am Deputy Director for POPVOX Foundation. I am a former caseworker. I am a former Social Security caseworker, which is relevant for what we're talking about today. And I lead our team's work on how Congress interacts with constituents, and in particular, our Casework Navigator program, dedicated to supporting caseworkers, elevating casework as a vital area of Congress's interbranch relationships and first branch Article 1 authority. And so today, this is the first in a series that we are kicking off, focused a little bit more on some of the substantive policy areas involved in casework. So some federal agencies do provide wonderful guidance materials, fabulous training for caseworkers, but it is always still helpful to have an outside, impartial expert perspective. So today I am so glad to be joined by a true Social Security expert, David Camp, CEO of the National Organization of Social Security Claimants Representatives. David began his career at a legal services program before working in private practice to represent disabled claimants for more than 25 years, focusing on service to the homeless. And prior to being named CEO of NOSSCR, he served as NOSSCR's Chief Policy Officer, a role in which he oversaw the organization's government affairs, SSA administrative, and litigation advocacy. He is the recipient of Social Security Region 7 Commissioner's Public Service Award and an Oscar Sweeney Award for Distinguished Service, honoring his work litigating an end to the secret ALJ policy, which is something I would love to hear more about if we have time. So David, welcome, and thank you, thank you, thank you. I know it's crazy on your end too, so thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
It's a great pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, and then today, folks, I know there are going to be a lot of questions. We are going to cover a lot of material, but please, 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 we want to make sure this is as helpful to you as possible. So drop anything on your mind in the Q&A function. We will do our best to get to as much as we can, and I will do my best to traffic cop here. So, David, could you start out by just telling us about NOSSCR, about the organization, what it does?
Yes, thanks. We are an organization of the claimants' representatives, so the beneficiaries' representatives. So that's oftentimes an attorney, but also you can be a non-attorney and represent someone going through the disability claim process, or someone who's on benefits and seeks a safe exit from benefits through work activity, or dealing with any other of a host of issues with Social Security, an overpayment or a customer service barrier or something along those lines. Our membership is made up of the advocates for all of those individuals. So we are we're with a claimant individually, trying to get something from or with Social Security on a day-to-day basis. And our membership is made up of several thousand of those practitioners throughout the country. And therefore, we're a key stakeholder for Social Security and for Congress and the media when it comes to being an independent voice on what's really going on and what could be fixed. But then also Social Security has the chance to have an external check-in about how they're really doing. And we comment on everything that shows up in the Federal Register. We're at every meeting. We're on the Hill when there's a hearing about Social Security. And so we've been for 45 years a stakeholder organization, external to SSA, but very collaborative. So they know that we will be honest, and therefore we can be honest when we're helping the general public and congressional offices understand what can and cannot be done.
That's wonderful. So that's an enormous resource and enormous support to a really vital agency. And then, so I know for most of us, definitely for me, when I joined the congressional office I worked for as a caseworker, Social Security was just dropped into my lap. And I fell in love with it. It was always my favorite portfolio out of the many that I had. But how did you personally end up focused on Social Security?
I was at a legal services program, and then suddenly the lawyers in the building that worked on the Social Security cases left. And so the executive director said, "That's your new caseload." And so I learned it very, very quickly. And fell in love with it right away, and realized that instead of some of the other cases that I had been doing in a legal services environment, like landlord-tenant or consumer protection matters, on Social Security, I had a client that would come with a dire need for income support and a need for health insurance support as well. And that if you had a meritorious claim and were successful, you directly addressed and solved both of those key problems. And so you would have 100% victories. You wouldn't have compromise. You wouldn't have anything other than the struggle of how long it takes and how hard it can be at times. But in terms of an area of law to practice in, it's thrilling and compelling because you are addressing a clear need with a direct solution. And they often say in other areas of law that both parties end up upset at the end in a settlement or such. That's not true with Social Security. You get the benefits that you need. You get out of the homeless shelter. You get back to some dignified way to survive the poverty and the other needs of a period of disability. And then it comes with Medicare, Medicaid, often options for both. And it's not a perfect solution. It doesn't provide transportation or food or shelter, but it can allow for those things to occur. So it's we think of it as the most robust and the largest and the most important aspect of our social safety net. And this advocacy lets you be a key component in gaining access to it.
That's wonderful. And I really appreciate then that it sounds like you have been in the same shoes as many of the caseworkers on this call, where you are dropped into Social Security and you have to learn it very quickly in these situations with constituents, with claimants where there's a lot on the line. So I really appreciate that you know how hard this is and have lived it in a very different way, but still similar, many of the folks here. So thinking about the difference between what your organization does, what your members do, and what congressional staff do, can you just walk us through a little bit of how a congressional inquiry differs from just what happens with a congressional inquiry differs from when just your ordinary constituent calls Social Security?
There really are three categories of engaging with Social Security on a matter. There's the claimant or the beneficiary directly to Social Security, where Social Security's customer service crisis can make it deeply frustrating. You can call and wait on hold, sometimes for longer than an hour, and end up with what's called a polite disconnect, which means they hang up. And you can end up getting through, and the person may not have an answer because they may not have access to the system that has the answer in it. The computer systems at Social Security are antiquated and don't connect. You could go to a field office and be told you have to come back with an appointment. And then you could end up coming to that appointment and it won't be the worker that was supposed to actually satisfy the question. So engaging as a beneficiary or claimant with Social Security without help is a great challenge. And we've all heard about that. There have been congressional hearings on it. And then there's having an appointed individual helper, an appointed representative, which could be a family member or an attorney or anything like that. And sometimes that can help because you gain access to some systems. An attorney can gain access to portals, online portals, to see a status of the case. Social Security in the last year has made great strides in making more of that updated data available to an appointed representative so that you can see the appeal was processed or the appeal has not yet been processed, something like that. The third category is as a caseworker, a constituent service effort. And that is a special kind of connection to Social Security because for a constituent in a district, Social Security provides a liaison then to the congressional office. And that liaison has authority to go anywhere and everywhere within the agency and find the answers and then report back if it's possible to find the answer. And sometimes it doesn't go fast. Sometimes it's high quality, sometimes it's low quality, but it is still a special, unique way to get around the customer service barriers that affect the many millions of communications that Social Security has to deal with. You get a special status, a special direct connection to what amounts to a supervisor, where every other component of the agency is supposed to comply with that supervisor's requests for information. So it's different in all three of those categories. The claimant directly hits basically the scary old version of the Department of Motor Vehicles kind of thing, where it's just frustrating and hard and probably worse than a DMV ever was. An appointed representative or a family member has their own access to things, and that can help. But a constituent services approach is sometimes far better, faster, and a more clear answer and a direct solution for that constituent.
That makes a ton of sense. So sometimes these can be complementary. So when the family member, NOSSCR member can't get what they're looking for, then they're not doing the same thing as Congress, but they're doing things that can fit together.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that if the constituent says, I have an attorney and my attorney can't get this answer, they're probably telling the truth, right? There is a lot of information that's difficult to get. While an attorney can see many things about a status of a case, there are long periods where you can see nothing. And there are frustrations. And Social Security works to build out their technology to provide information flow, but they have to be very careful. It has to be very secured. And they use antiquated systems. And by antiquated, I don't mean 2010. I mean 1980, 1985. So they are, you know, they're not setting up something like these fancy new API structures or anything like that. They're showing you data that is on a reel-to-reel server with a green screen that controls it. That's, you know, with an old programming language nobody's ever heard of. And it's a great challenge for them. So it's slow coming, the answers. And sometimes then when it's a constituent services inquiry, it's the shoe leather approach. You've got this authorized connection who gets on the phone and goes to the other office and produces a report. And that can be a tremendous benefit.
Just to kind of put a finer point on it for maybe new caseworkers who are still trying to figure out just, hey, what is this job here? Can you talk us through any places in particular where you've really seen a congressional office and a congressional inquiry just unstick something difficult?
Yes, certainly it can be shocking that if you have a constituent who's been approved for a benefit payment, they've been found disabled, maybe even by a judge with a 15-page opinion, and they've gone several years now through a process, 3, 5, sometimes 10 years, and they're finally approved. The payment doesn't come. The payment still comes many months later, and sometimes more than a year later. And that's a very frustrating part of the process because the claimant is aware that there's no more disagreement. Nobody doubts the eligibility. And you can have a hot call at that point, right? With what amounts to a customer that has been waiting on hold for years, right? And so that point of frustration is also a point where appointed representatives and the beneficiary or the claimant lack access to data and can't get through. These payment centers or processing centers that Social Security operates don't answer the phone. They often don't have phones. And so you'll get a lot of contact from people who say, where's my check? And if they're in the disability claim population, they're not making that up. They can be approved, and it can be a very long time before a check comes, even when the criteria are clear cut and satisfied. And then sometimes there's an overpayment issue that has very successfully come to the national conversation through a 60 Minutes story and otherwise, congressional hearing as well. And in dealing with correcting a Social Security record, it's very much the same thing. And it can be sometimes those same offices that don't have really any attempt at customer service. And when you're dealing with on an overpayment context, sometimes the obligation to be paying back and you want to dutifully do so, or if you're waiting for an underpayment, money that Social Security is supposed to be sending you so that you can exit your dire poverty and go get a place to stay or go, get your own bus pass, that is a sense of urgency where the caseworker communication is by far the best way to get an answer and the clearest answer. And then it can unstick it. They'll answer, we were just working on it and we're backlogged. And oh, by the way, the check went out yesterday.
And I will say, again, there is just no better feeling than being able to call a constituent and give that news. And for caseworkers working in offices that track data, like that is the big one your comms team is going to ask you to keep an eye on, is the money that you bring back to constituents through underpayments, through retroactive benefits. So definitely keep an eye out there, and those can be really rewarding.
No grudge about this, but I have had clients who you worked for, 100 hours over years, and you finally win the case. And because of a congressional inquiry, the check got released finally. And they're like, you didn't get me my benefits. My member of Congress did. And that's fine. That's good.
Yeah. And credit due for everyone involved in those tough cases. But that actually raises something that I think is really hard for Social Security caseworkers when they're first getting started, which is you mentioned a few things here, just the processing centers and trying to figure out where these cases are, what's the difference between an overpayment and underpayment, how does this all relate into health insurance? For new folks just trying to get their feet under them and figure out, oh my gosh, what is this agency and how does it work? Do you have any recommendations for where to go, how to wrap their heads around this huge agency?
Well, one thing that is helpful and gets better and better is SSA's website, ssa.gov. They have explainers for almost everything. And I'll often do that, refined search using a search engine, site:/ssa.gov, and then I put my search terms after it so that what I'm searching is SSA's public facing website, where you can get quite good information. And NOSSCR has on our website, we have links to SSA's more detailed policy manuals, which are for the field offices and the payment centers called POMS, POMS. And for the appeals, it's called HALEX, HALLEX. And then there's the regulations and the statute and on and on. So if you're really doing a deep dive, go to noscr.org and look at our links to those policy manuals, which are otherwise hard to find on the internet. But for just general explainers and even websites that you could direct a constituent to, the SSA.gov structure will get you there. And if you ever have trouble finding where an answer is for something, you can always reach out to my association and we'll point you right to it.
Which is so comforting. I really appreciate that. And I'll say for casework teams too, their Social Security does publish a caseworker manual. You have to put in your mail.house.gov or your senate.gov email address to get access to it. It is a good starting point. But like you said, supplementing that with the rest of the publicly available information from NOSSCR is really, really helpful.
And if say has something that's at all off or misleading, we tell them, and so it's pretty up to date. It's reliable.
And also helpful to recognize there are places to bring questions about whether something is misleading or incorrect or confusing. And that is a helpful thing that caseworkers can also flag to you, to Social Security.
Yeah.
Be a helpful part of the process.
Yeah, their deputy commissioner for communications or in their associate, their leadership structure for their communications component at SSA is always concerned with how clear their website is, whether or not they have the right explainers on there and pamphlets and such. And so if you flag things that you can't find on SSA.gov because they need to be easier to find or they're not there at all yet, let us know and we'll communicate that to SSA, and I'm sure they'd be thrilled to get that information on their website.
And let me just also say too, this is a really helpful kind of fine point to flag too, because sometimes when congressional offices go to the main DC liaison, they say, hey, this is confusing. It kind of gets shifted into an oversight track and the agencies get a little bit worried. So sometimes coming through an organization like yours to say, hey, we noticed this, can you flag it? In a relationship that you have that's a little bit less formally adversarial than Congress and the executive branch can be an effective way to get something done quickly.
True. Yes.
And then also, and again, I say this as a former Social Security caseworker, I have made every mistake in the book. I've been there. I have sent the inquiry with the poor wording. I have sent the inquiry with the wrong number attached. Like I have done all of this. But are there places where you find that congressional caseworkers can be confused on a specific type of case and send an inquiry that sets a case back, or accidentally not be clear enough in the way that they word cases? Just any tips on how to really make those inquiries work?
Well, one early tip is to make sure you have the right authorization, that you have the claimant or the beneficiary as the individual who's pursuing the information. If it's a family member, Social Security rightfully will pause and wonder if they have authority to communicate about that claim to what amounts to a third party then. And they protect information at Social Security. So that they don't want in a divorce case, they don't want one spouse gathering information from Social Security directly. They're going to need to see a court order and that type of thing. And so we're grateful for that protectiveness, but it can be a barrier when you're just asking a question if you don't realize that you had even the wrong name, or you're actually have the name and social for the family member and they're talking about the 20-year-old son in the household. Well, you're going to need that 20-year-old son's consent, and that's who you're working for then to Social Security. They don't recognize that the whole family has access to a file. They recognize individuals. So that's one tip. Another is to try to identify the category of the pain point. Is it about the status of a disability claim, a retirement benefit, or a survivor's benefit check, or the category of benefit helps, the type of benefit, and you can get that from the top of the letters. So if it's an SSI question, which is supplemental security income, very much more complicated rules, lots of difficulty in complying with those rules because they're monthly reporting rules. and they're antiquated, they're hard. You have to have less than 2,000 in total assets and earnings, change your check month after month, every month. So if it's SSI, that constituent will have a letter at the top of it. It will say supplemental security income, the very top line in bold. If it's not about supplemental security income, it will say the other thing, which is retirement, survivors, and disability insurance. Then it's the other category of benefits. So you can do some sleuthing to narrow to make sure your request of Social Security ends up with the right teams, with the right components. And if you can land in the right office at Social Security, they can often figure out the rest because they see the rest of the activity. But if it goes on a SSI case to a payment center that only handles regular Social Security payments and not SSI, you may go a very long time with no response because they're still hunting, hunting for where that might be. So the tip there is actually to see a document from the constituent and to work from it. So then you got it narrowed down. What office is mailing them a letter? What case type do they have from the very top of the letter? And then if you can show Social Security the most recent correspondence from Social Security, it helps them catch up too.
That is so helpful. And I will say, I think you made a really key point that I think a lot of offices get confused on internally. I know my team definitely our mental map of Social Security casework was retirement, issues with identity verification, Social Security numbers, and then both disability programs, SSDI and SSI. But from Social Security's perspective, it's SSI versus everything else. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. And they have these payment center offices. They break things up by social and age and things like that. So they definitely can get more and more complicated the deeper you get into SSA. But you can solve for that by having the letters, having a clear view of the most recent correspondence to that constituent from SSA. And then you don't have to translate. You don't have to say, this person has the following kind of case and is dealing with the following kind of office at SSA. You have the letter that actually says that in SSA's phrasing. You'll see PC7 up there if they're dealing with Payment Center 7, which has a specific office somewhere else. Or you'll see the status of the case often just within the first few sentences in a letter. And so when a new potential client calls for representation, would call me over the years and say, I'm having trouble explaining what's going on here, I would say, well, then don't keep trying. Read me the most recent letter from Social Security, and I'll be able to tell you what's going on after about one paragraph, because they're template letters. And SSA will have the same approach. If they can see that template letter, then they'll know where to hunt.
That is so helpful. And that gets to something I wanted to ask you where I don't think that there is a straightforward answer. Maybe there is, I hope there is. But which is, I think one of the hardest things as a new caseworker is developing your judgment when you're listening to a constituent tell you what's going on and ask for help. You'll hear some crazy stories. This judge swore at me in a hearing, or I'm being personally targeted. You hear some really crazy things. So how do you kind of hone your judgment as an attorney thinking about how to sort through what a constituent is telling you to understand what's happening?
It's helpful to have a general sense of what SSA does and does not really do. So if you're getting a call, and I think many offices right now, I was just on the Hill last week going through some offices, and the phones are ringing off the hook. And it's calls about whether or not the Doge teams are looking at their information, right? It's constituents that are concerned because they saw a news story and they're wondering if they're going to get cut off, or if there's some new set of rules, or if somebody's looking at their Social Security number or their medical records and what is really going on up there, right? And that can get prompted by media coverage. And the same thing happened after the overpayments story was on 60 Minutes. Offices were flooded with calls about overpayments then. And so that's the value of understanding that SSA, let's take overpayments, for example, has a process where they calculate overpayments that always runs slower. And so an overpayment grows because of how long it takes to really figure out and catch up on the paperwork. And then they will send out sort of a demand letter, and then you can work on repayment terms or asking SSA to waive that overpayment. And then if you don't like their answer on those things, you can go through an appeals process. So if you understand that sequence, and you can also understand a similar sequence for what it's like to try to apply for retirement benefits or disability benefits, or what it's like to change your name or apply for a new Social Security number or a Social Security card. And you have that sense of what SSA does and in what sequence, then you can put the caller into the right bucket, for where they are, which of these different processes they're actually in. So if a caller is asking about, is there somebody accessing my medical records? Well, there isn't any real bucket for that. I have this question now. Do I bother to pass this through, or I just say, thank you for your concern. I'll pass it through to the congressman, that sort of thing. If Social Security doesn't have a process for that, they don't keep a record of whether or not some treasury system engaged with their system, and they don't do that client by client or claimant by claimant and report that anywhere, then you won't spin your wheels asking for a piece of paper that Social Security doesn't even have. So if it sounds prompted by media and political, often you'll be wasting time trying to get Social Security to confirm whether a thing happened. But if it sounds like a true customer service barrier, like they have a pending case and they can't find out what's going on with it, then you have a great reason to contact the agency.
So helpful, especially, you're right, with the volume of calls offices are getting right now.
Yeah.
And I want to circle back on something and just ask you, if you don't mind giving a really high level explanation, because I think this is also one of the most confusing parts of Social Security for new caseworkers, which is understanding that appeals process. I know when I was a caseworker, again, looking at my buckets, I had people waiting for that first check, and then I had people stuck in the appeals process who were just saying, hey, is there anything my member of Congress can do to nudge me through this faster or have any kind of impact on the way this appeals process happens? Can you just walk through what is that appeals process, and where are there places where that kind of inquiry can be helpful?
The appeals process on a disability case is initial application and then reconsideration. And those two steps are both handled by state agencies called DDS offices, Disability Determination Service. And so they look alike, the initial stage and the reconsideration stage, but you have to go through those two before the third stage, which is a hearing in front of an administrative law judge, or ALJ. After the hearing in front of an ALJ, you can appeal yet again within the agency to what's called the Appeals Council. And then if you lose at all four of those stages, you have the right to file a complaint in federal court. And if you don't appeal and your case ends, you often can reapply because disability is ongoing. There's certain new facts in a new time period. And so you have many constituents who have applied multiple times, and some of them have really never appealed. So they've applied 5 times, they were denied at the initial stage 5 times, and never pursued their rights on an appeal, which they should have. So those steps are all, there's no filing fees, there's no fee to file an appeal, you just fill out the form. You generally have 60 days plus 5 for mail for each of those appeals. You only have 10 days if it's a benefit getting cut off to request that the benefits keep coming during your appeal. So you don't want to say it's always 60 days. You want to tell them to look at the letter, because sometimes it will say contact us within 10 to keep your check coming. But it's for the most part that 1, 2, 3, 4 step at the agency part of the world, and then a federal court option after that. Now the volume changes dramatically. So there's 1 volume for new claims at initial, and then it's a 10th as many or a 20th as many at reconsideration, because many people don't appeal. And then yet again, a fraction that go to the judge. But the longer you pursue the appeal, the more due process you get. You get at the judge stage a chance to talk to the decision maker, to present evidence and to see your file and to make sure it's complete, and to have an advocate. You get to question a witness for whether there are jobs for that person. It's a lot of good due process. At the initial application stage and the reconsideration stage, not so much. You're just filling out some forms and sending them in, and you're hoping that they get all your medical records. And the thing that most offices can be able to say, and should say, is that they are concerned about the delay, and that there are more than 1 million claims pending at that initial application stage, and that they support modernizing Social Security's systems as a solution. That's bipartisan. I think there is debate between Democrats and Republicans as to whether or not additional funding is a solution or additional staffing is a solution. But both parties, every office agrees that some technological assistance, modernization, cutting out inefficiencies is a high priority. And for example, not mailing medical records that are digital in the first place, and instead just exchanging them the way you can log into your MyChart and see your file. We want SSA to be able to get evidence immediately rather than have a delayed and sometimes the evidence never coming to them, so that then you see these many months of a process. Basic fixes like that are actually policy topics often, we find that every office supports.
And if I can just log roll for you for 1 second here, you posted a heat map the other day of just the ALJ waiting times on LinkedIn. So caseworkers, follow Mr. Camp on LinkedIn. It's wonderful. I learn so much all the time.
Social Security is very big on heat maps now.
Love it. Well, we're going to get to the policy in a second. I don't mean to jump ahead because I get excited about things like Social Security stat and data dashboards.
Yeah.
I know we'll get there. So one thing that I think is important for folks to realize is, like you've said, so much of where offices can really be helpful with constituents may not even necessarily be opening up a case, sending in an inquiry, pursuing all of this labor. It's more helping constituents understand what the agency does, what the process is, what they can expect in that process. So we are seeing a lot of offices do more service fairs, service events for constituents, do more public service announcements about agencies, explainers about how agencies work on their social media, on their websites. Is that something where folks can ask you for help, can join up with you for joint events, joint PSAs? How can we all work together?
Absolutely. Yeah, always happy to do that.
That's awesome. Is that something like hosting a service fair where NOSSCR claims representatives come and talk to people?
Yeah, it's a
Depends on the
challenge
member.
for us. With our staff is only 9, 10, 11 people, and so going to a district in person can be a challenge at times. Sometimes we can always do things remotely, virtually, and if events are in DC, definitely, for sure. But in the district, there are times when it happens to work and we can attend a town hall type event or something like that. Just ask. We can do as much as we can, and we love doing that kind of thing, because we're an education focused nonprofit association, and if we're getting out these detailed answers, and also the message that Social Security needs all of us to keep an eye on it and to be supportive of it, whether you want it to have a higher budget or not, we all want it to work, and we all want them to answer the phone and to open the mail and to respond to questions. And the pained calls that you'll get are the same pained calls that the rest of us get.
That's awesome. So I know I'm probably signing you guys up for hopefully a flood of caseworkers reaching out to ask just how can you all work together. But yeah, just always a reminder, there are rules within Congress that say you can reach out to local resources, you can partner with nonprofits. Like, your team doesn't have to do all of this alone. Is really important. And let me just remind folks too, if you have questions, please go ahead and drop them in the Q&A so I'm not hogging the whole conversation. And we're happy to dive into any particular details that might be on your mind. But then moving on to policy, if we can. So we're getting into a little bit of how casework can drive oversight, how casework surfaces some of the issues that do point to a need for structural changes within Social Security. It seems like the agency has undergone a lot of transformation in the last couple of years. There's a lot on the radar. What are the big changes that you guys are keeping an eye on for NOSSCR?
We are actually really excited right now, but we're excited all this past year. It's a leadership change, of course. We had a commissioner come in right around Christmas of 2023, Martin O'Malley, who had been a governor and had a lot of management history, management of large organizations, because the state has a lot of people to marshal resources for and to organize into teams. And he'd been a mayor of Baltimore, and he was a fan of this stat structure that he did as Bay Stat at first for environmental cleanup of the Chesapeake, and then City Stat for Baltimore, and then State Stat for Maryland. And that was very new for Social Security. It meant a different technique, a different accountability, a different focus on data, which all of us love, right? We love seeing those heat maps, but we also love seeing whether or not the heat maps are changing and why, and whether people are being held accountable for whether or not something turned from red to green. And so that was great work this past year, really exciting. And we expect a lot of it to continue, but with a new approach from he's not confirmed yet, but Frank Bisignano has been nominated to be the permanent commissioner for a full 6-year term. Martin O'Malley was completing a prior term, so really only had 1 year of the end of a term. But if Bisignano becomes the commissioner of Social Security, then we have a CEO of a large financial institution, Fiserv, and an executive from JP Morgan, Chase, the banking sector generally, with a reputation for being a fixer, with a reputation for leveraging talent and motivating teams, but also with an emphasis on technology. And it's not a joke. Social Security would be modernized by fax machines, right? Like Social Security needs any energy about tech and modernization. We're desperate for it. And so energy around that, gaining access to resources from other components of the federal government, we're thrilled by that conversation, because you can't have 20 different federal agencies building separate fraud detection devices when Treasury has a wonderful one and should share it, or building from scratch an AI as a government agency with contractors when the private sector is building dynamic and increasingly cheaper, robust forms of AI that are also capable of withstanding critique over bias and such, because they have to be used in parts of the world where lawsuits exist and things like that. We want that approach, and we're really excited. Frank Bisignano is an outsider to the world of running a government agency and to Social Security itself, but is an American. So he's clearly going to be passionate about reforming Social Security or modernizing Social Security, and comes to it with this fresh approach. And a lot of outsiders are going to come with him. And so we're really hopeful.
And we need a hopeful take right now. It's been such a crazy few weeks. That's really wonderful to hear that it sounds like change may be on the horizon. We just got some really good questions in the Q&A, so let me jump right in. If someone asks, I sometimes struggle with when to submit a congressional inquiry with SSA. We get a lot of inquiries from constituents who have claims within typical processing times, but then they can't get through to anyone on the phone or in person with SSA. I will then take it for action just to get an initial response, but I also don't want to strain relationships with our local field office. Do you have any guidance on how to navigate this? Such a good question.
Yeah, and it's a perpetual question, right? It is so the answer is to keep it about something that really is actionable. If it's the same question every week, at some point the Social Security office is going to say, really, we said it's going to take 3 months, so you're just consuming our resources. But if it's actually that they said 3 months and now it's been 6, and you're getting back to them. So it's that normal respecting that this is a challenged office, short-staffed and with no tech, and always behind on everything. And so it's about that respect of their time and their resources. And that's really all you can do. They get it. They field requests all the time from people that are just frustrated by the customer service barriers. So they're not offended by a question that is, I thought something, I was told in a notice that something was going to occur by now and it hasn't occurred. And it matters to me a lot because it's my income. They do that all day, every day. And they, in my experience, do pay more positive attention to a congressional inquiry. In fact, for many years, the database that they were using, essentially, the checkbox for the status of whether or not a case is supposed to be prioritized or moving quickly through the system, was only one checkbox for dire need, which would be, they call it their Terry box, which is terminal illness. So medical evidence that the person would pass away in less than 90 days, / homelessness, / foreclosure scheduled, / congressional office asked. All the same category, right? So they do actually have a system for prioritizing, and it's equal to how they prioritize someone who's terminally ill. So that's a positive and a negative. You want to make sure that you are needing that prioritization, which is what everybody has a right to that's reaching out to their member of Congress. But you also don't want to abuse it because you're in the category of people that are trying to get out of homelessness and dealing with a foreclosure.
And I'm so glad you brought up dire need. And I was going to ask, um, is that something that can be appropriate and helpful for congressional office if they're working with a constituent and they find out this person has shifted into that dire need bucket? Is that a helpful, useful thing to flag for Social Security?
It is, yeah. There are times when Social Security has a dire need case and maybe has acknowledged it in other ways, like maybe a caseworker just said, yes, you have a dire need case, and
Mhm.
yet the box isn't checked. And we've been struggling for years to get access to that externally so that the lawyer could see, did you process that? Is it really marked for the fast track? It hasn't happened yet. So there will be calls from people who say, I think I'm supposed to be dire need, or they're describing a dire need situation, and you're trying to just get that box checked or to clarify that it's already checked and Social Security does have a manager on it instead of the backlogged frontline worker. That's a status that's really worth understanding and knowing whether it's on the case or not, or getting it applied to a case. And again, it's those same standards: terminal illness, which is not, you may die with this in a few years, but 90 days basically, or in hospice, or pending foreclosure, or homelessness, or you guys asked, but you don't want to like have it just be that. You want to have, if you're asking about dire need status, you want to have it fit in those first three categories.
Super helpful. So again, I hope everyone got those three categories. You have that pinned on a post-it on your desk that's available. Perfect. Such a good question. And then we got another one that I think is going to maybe open us up for another conversation about just the field office staffing and customer service. So someone asks, why does the SSA zip code locator mostly show the national 800 number rather than the actual field office phone numbers? What can be done here?
Great question. And I know the answer, and it's not a good answer. It's you guys. It's claims.
Oh no.
So the funding to create that guide to the phone numbers and addresses came in a certain kind of appropriations package. It was the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1991, I think. And it said in there, you can't use this for a category of offices. You can only, it's to display the information about a different category of offices. And the field offices have several categories. And so the language in an appropriations bill from a prior generation is causing SSA to not show you the phone number for a local office. Now, NOSSCR has those phone numbers, and we distribute it to our membership because we know this problem. But it's absurd. And you would think that at some point somebody would just add that line to an appropriations bill that said, never mind, just show us all the phone numbers because that helps more than the 800 number.
Incredible. So whoever asked or anybody else on here, if your boss is an appropriator, appropriations are scary, but we do have a guide to appropriations for caseworkers on our website. I can send it out. Bug me, I'll email it to you. That sounds like it would be an enormously valuable use of time.
Yeah.
I love it.
If you're giving Social Security money for something, don't say it's only for, type 1 field offices without realizing you're going to cause this problem. Just let them have a bit more of a generalized use of the money.
Incredibly helpful, especially as, again, as caseworkers, you're ideally gathering data on the cases you're seeing, you're sending that to your ledge team, you're sending that to your policy team and saying, hey, how can we fix this? Like, that's such good advice on don't fix it too narrowly.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of just changes that you would make to Social Security, I know that you guys do a lot of advocacy on the admin side and the regulatory side, and then talking to policymakers. If you have priorities on just what needs fixed, if you have the magic wand for Social Security tomorrow, where do you start?
Well, I'll start with the granular, and then there's the macro, right? So the granular is Social Security and other federal agencies should be excitedly and rapidly adopting what we call a public benefits use case for TAFCA. A lot of jargon there, but what that means is there are these digital health information exchanges out there. If you use MyChart or these other types of things, your medical records and your medical information is stored digitally, safely, securely, and you control it with your consent and such. But we want that information to go to SSA so that they can save months and money and staffing instead of literally mailing out release forms and saying, print all that stuff out and mail it to us and then we'll scan it back in and then OCR it and then have bad data. We want just a digital exchange set up, still protecting privacy and security and having consent. But we're trying to establish that for Social Security as a top priority without real legislation, more expressing Congress's support for such a concept to encourage then hospital systems and others to just turn it on. The structures already exist. It's already accepted by 10 to 20% of all the hospital systems in the country. And so we're trying to create more of a groundswell of support for a very straightforward idea that cuts that processing time down, that million claim backlog, and costs Social Security less instead of needing to appropriate, and frees up some of those staff to answer the phone. So Social Security field office staff are scanning in medical records that were digital a month earlier when they were put in the mail, right? And you could just share it digitally, like the health systems do to each other. So that's the granular. The macro is the trust fund for Social Security, which is the supplement essentially for everyone's eligibility. You're actually getting, when you're on Social Security, money that's paid in now by workers. It's money in, money out. But there's an extra amount that you get to keep the benefits always going up over generations, called a trust fund. And it comes from times when the payments in are sort of above what's necessary, and it gets flush and builds. And then there are times, because of demographics primarily and tax structures, where it starts to drain. And it's draining now, and it wasn't supposed to, but it's draining faster than predicted because the tax structure got out of whack. We had a lot of high earners. A lot of people did well in the modern economy and make more than the Social Security cutoff, and it's not getting taxed. And so there's less than they thought when they set up this structure back in the 80s. And so the trust fund is running out in about 8 years, which means only the money in is going to be the money going out, which is about 80% or so of what people are expecting. So instead of having a 20% reduction in everybody's check, we want everybody to just be rational and talk and figure it out. We need members of Congress to just huddle and agree and acknowledge that nobody wants that 20% reduction, and there's going to have to be a package of things that get us there. So we don't want either side of the aisle yelling anymore or pointing fingers anymore. It's time, while it gets harder as you get closer to that cutoff, that cliff. Might as well do it now. Might as well do it when there's any political opportunity. And it just takes being reasonable and getting along, and the two parties getting along. And we're always excited to hear that, the chair of the Ways and Means Committee is actually talking to the ranking on the Ways and Means Committee about a Social Security solution. That's what we need. And not, how dare you talk about Social Security, or the thing you proposed is heinous, or anything extreme. Then we run out of time.
I know we always hear about Social Security as that third rail, but as you say, this is something that touches every constituent in everybody's district. Like, there are a lot of good reasons to have that conversation.
Yeah, and if you pick only one of the things that would move the needle, you're on the third rail. If you say, I'm only going to tax more people, and that's how we do it, or I'm only going to reduce the benefits, and that's how we solve it, or I'm going to only raise the retirement age. Not only are you saying something that some of the constituents hate, and often most of them, but you haven't actually done the math. You have to do a mix of a dozen different things to solve for this. And then it's compromise. And, in politics, then you just work on the words and letting everybody know that that's why you got sent to Washington or something like that, is to figure out compromise and make it work. But you actually can't solve this problem financially with only one of those things. So there's no point in standing on a soapbox and saying it's the only answer.
Love it. We have a couple of the really good questions, so I want to dive back in over here. So someone asks, from your national perspective, what regional differences do you see in SSA-FO operations, regional public affairs offices, PSCs, and HO operations? Seems like there should be uniform operations and activity, but we know there are significant differences, both from a constituent perspective and a casework perspective. Do you think these regional differences are fair and reasonable, or would more uniform operations be beneficial? What a good question.
It is. And Social Security actually struggles with that because it's axiomatic with Social Security that uniformity and consistency around the country is of value for Social Security, because it's inefficient. And they struggle if they have one region running 100 days different than another region. They try to share resources, but what they hit up against is things like structures that are still local, so that the data is staying local, the management is staying local, and the number of staff that they have is locally different then. So they can hire based on the salaries they're authorized to offer in some parts of the country and fully staff. But if you are staffing a call center and you're near a call center for Amazon, you can't hire as well. It's not the same. And if you're trying to staff up a Social Security office in the Bay Area in California, your salaries aren't competitive. And so they have almost empty offices in some places. And sometimes it's as simple as the VA offered a better benefits package and a little bit different telework or something like that. And that happened near Cleveland just last year, where a Social Security office closed because the workers all stopped working there and went to go work for the VA. And there were only 5 or 6, and then they all left at the same time. So it can be a way, depending on your members' proposed solution to Social Security's customer service crisis, it can be a way to pivot to that, where you say, our office supports the following solution to these problems with Social Security, and it would address the problem here that here we have 300 days at the initial application stage, whereas in Iowa, it's only 150 days. And those solutions are things like modern data systems, management that is capable of managing nationally and not just spread throughout the country. And then also not doing some of the tasks, like not scanning in records by paper, because you have to be very local for that. But if it's a digital exchange, you can operate all of that out of Maryland if you need to.
Love that. And let me just take a moment to put in a plug for something the House is working on. If you've been to any of our webinars before, you've heard me rant about this. I'm super excited about it. But the House is currently working on a top-line anonymized data aggregator that will pull casework data from members of Congress across the country, again, into one of those beautiful heat maps. So ideally, we can start to see, hey, where are congressional offices getting a disproportionate number of calls on Social Security? To flag, are there regions that need specific more investment or any of the solutions that you've just talked about? So I'm always happy to answer questions or talk to folks offline about that project underway, but it's really exciting.
Yeah.
We got another just comment that during the pandemic, those local phone numbers were available on the website. Let me just also put in a plug for caseworkers too. Again, this is a great question for some of the big caseworkers assistance teams chats for folks to share these with you. Social Security does give caseworkers individual regional field office guides with the direct phone numbers, the direct email addresses for the processing centers for your field office leaders. So again, if you don't have those yet, definitely worth reaching out to your peers, reaching out to Social Security to just ask for those, because they're an enormously helpful resource. We got a comment here also about there are might be other reasons to request expediting process of cases, including military veteran status and utility shutoff notices. David, I wonder if you could talk a little bit to, some of those other ways that you might be able to expedite these.
On that, but that's less certain as a checkbox kind of thing. But you can get, depending on the worker, depending on the manager, you can get faster attention to cases. Certainly in the decision-making about whether there's a disability, there are these compassionate allowance categories, and 100% rated veteran has a category for a fast track on the decision-making about the disability. But that's not the same thing as the general processing of a payment and paperwork and such. So it doesn't hurt to express that. It's certainly always a good idea to express those things, to gain an advocate inside of SSA, basically. There are high odds that you're either talking to someone who served or who cares about those who served in a way that's motivating. And you have to, do what you can to get the response. And that's certainly, those are good ways to motivate.
Love that. Yeah, and it's such a good point. I think that's always a really good key as you're thinking about interacting with your agency liaisons. Just make your constituent human. Like, you've probably fallen with them a little bit. Just share why it matters to you.
And sometimes a simple description of the health condition that they have, like this is somebody going through chemotherapy, or this is somebody who's up for a transplant. It might not fit a fast track by the exact definition, but you get the same response if somebody starts to really care.
I love that. That's really important. And maybe let me skip down one, because this is a helpful transition. So as we're talking about military service, military status, Amber asks, I often have difficulty explaining to military veterans the differences between disability criteria under the VA and SSA and how those benefits work when combined. Do you have any suggestions to make that more understandable?
It is, it's unfortunately complicated. And a general summary of it is that for Social Security, the criteria is insured status or lack of insured status for the case of SSI, which is then poverty, and the inability to hold any full-time job for more than a year, including the ones you had before. So it's about the ability to work and it's about functioning. It's not, there's no magic impairment that does it or diagnosis. It's about how it affects you. So it's a functional inability to work, and it could be 5 impairments combined. For veterans benefits, there's this added component of connection to service and whether things are theoretically or actually dated to what occurred during service. And then a second change is that they have fractions over there. You can be a percent. And so there's percentage checks. You can be partially eligible with the VA. With Social Security, it's all or nothing.
We're all familiar with VA math, and it's the worst thing ever.
Yeah.
That
And there
is
are offsets, especially when you're on what amount to the, if you're at the insured version and the service-connected version, so insured version at SSA and service-connected version at VA, those don't necessarily off, but the uninsured version over here, which is SSI, and the non-service connected things, those typically offset. And so whether there's an offset is not ever a simple answer. Like you have to really know for sure what kind of benefit you're talking about.
Is such a royal pain. But also this is, let me just say for caseworkers who handle Social Security and VA, this is one of these cool moments where like no one else, very few other people besides folks at NOSSCR have that perspective on how this works for one constituent across multiple agencies. And that's a really, really critical piece for oversight that like you should be talking to your policy team about.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, we have a couple of other questions and not very much time, so I'm just going to pick this one here to round up here. So what work are you doing to advocate for the adoption of new occupational descriptions for disability determinations? I know this has been a big deal for NOSSCR. I wonder if you could say just a little bit more.
Sure. They still unfortunately use a book that hasn't been updated since the very beginning of the 1990s. And so it contains these embarrassing entries of jobs that clearly haven't existed since I was born. And so it taints the reliability of the disability evaluation process. It makes it hard to explain publicly in every other environment. It's just wrong to say, you know, we're going to assess you and your ability to work now in modern times based on what it was like in 1975 when you could actually, you know, put on a pair of gloves and work on a computer chip. And now those are all robots, you know. The advocacy that we're doing is to get Social Security to use a Department of Labor resource that's already been created and contracted. Social Security pays tens of millions per year to the Department of Labor for a new system that is a jobs directory. And they have only barely started to acknowledge that it exists, even though it's their system and they pay for it. And so our advocacy has been to just get on updating your refined policies, your more detailed aspects of things, and start using this thing that's already paid for. You don't have to come up with a new idea. Don't need to do a new appropriation. No new bill is necessary. Just do it and do it quickly. And so it's been a frustrating area of our advocacy. There was some movement toward toward the second half of 2024, but it has really required it getting in the national news and being mentioned in hearings and congressional, you know, sign-on letters to do something you would think would be straightforward.
And that like just to do it is where oversight is so important from Congress. That's the telling your boss to raise that question in the hearing. Hey, my constituent had this experience with an ALJ. Like, why hasn't this happened yet?
Yeah.
Really appreciate that.
You know, the job of dresser is a very common job to be cited in a denial, and it was replaced by the computer printer back in the 80s. That's handwriting of addresses for commercial mailings and by the thousands, right? You would never do that now, right? You print those out. So it's embarrassing and it needs to be fixed. And the fix is already done. So it's exciting if Frank Bisignano comes in and has this punch list of things. Some of them are just say yes next to it and hand it off to the staff.
And I love that, again, we can end on a really positive note that like it is possible for this to work better, and as we're at this point partly and thanks to your team at NOSSCR and the work that you've been doing to really work on that advocacy. So thank you for all of your service, all of your help for congressional offices, and then again for sharing your expertise and joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, and I will say again, this former Social Security caseworker just had such a good time getting back into the weeds on this. So thank you again. So folks, caseworkers on this call, again, thank you also so much. I know it's been a crazy few weeks. We really appreciate you spending your time with us. Again, so all of our resources are up at casework, popvox.org/casework. We have our manuals for running casework operations. We have our newsletter where we announce things like this webinar. And flag agency news that you might see showing up in your casework. I repost a lot of David's LinkedIn content, making sure that you all see that. If there's any other way that we can be helpful, if there's any other resource that you feel like you're missing, please don't hesitate to reach out. I am at ann@popvox.org. It is not hard. The email you get the newsletter is genuinely my email. So please don't hesitate to reach out. Let us know how we can be helpful. And then David, all of your materials are noscr.org?
Yeah, and I'm at david.camp@noscr.org.
Wonderful. I really appreciate that. Awesome. Well, thank you all so much and have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.
Thanks.